good afternoon, evening, or morning, depending on where you're located in the globe. This is a DDEX webinar on the recording data and rights standards known as RDR, and we will be walking you through some aspects of the standard and also to give you some indication of one particular place where it's going to be used. My name is Mark Ishwood, and along my colleague Niels Rump, we lead the DDEX Secretariat. I will provide you with a brief overview of DDEX. Niels will then look at some of the details of the RDR standard, and then I'll talk briefly about how RDR is being used in a project which is known as RDX, which I'll explain at the time. So that's our agenda for this webinar. We are very happy to take questions at any time during the webinar, which you should do by using the chat facility on the system. This is the first time we've done a series of webinars of this nature. Obviously, hope it will be informative and would very much welcome your feedback. I will be sending out a link to a very, very short questionnaire after the webinar and would ask that you spend literally 2 or 3 minutes providing information so that we can gauge your views. And as I said, any questions you have as we go along, please use the chat facility and we will endeavour to answer your questions. So, as I said, this is a whole series of webinars, and the remaining ones that are in this time zone are on the 2nd of July, 15:30 UTC is 4:30 PM British Summer Time. And on the 2nd of July, we will do a webinar on a relatively new standard, which was only launched or published a couple of months ago, called the Claim Detail Message. And then on the 24th of September, we will look at its sister standard, the Digital Sales Report. And in between those, on the 10th of September, we will be going through the various standards that are used to support the licensing of mechanical rights in musical works in the US, namely the Musical Work Notification Standard, the Musical Work Licensing Standard, and the Letter of Direction Standard. We are also doing webinars at a different time zone, really with those people who are east of London in mind, and covering some of the other standards that we have. So I think DDEX is probably best known for standardizing formats of messages, and indeed that is probably what we spend most of our time doing. And the focus there is to standardize the order and the interaction of the format of messages that are used to move data up and down the digital music value chain. And although we use a number of building blocks that are essentially the same throughout all our standards, for example, how we describe a sound recording or a musical work, each of the standards will have variations in their construction because they're there to support a particular type of business transaction within the value chain. And so inevitably there's going to be differences in the way things are formatted because different business transactions place different weight on different types of data. However, we also combine that with standardizing choreographies. And what that means is standardizing the order in which messages get exchanged. And sometimes that will involve triggers, so that if a certain activity takes place, that will trigger the exchange of a message. And those will be agreed and standardized. Most of that at the moment is around secure FTP sites, and so that's the protocols. I'll come to that in a minute. I'm getting myself muddled up. So the choreographies are there to help determine who sends what message when and what the triggers are for doing that. The protocols are the mechanism by which the messages actually get sent, and as I was beginning to say, most of that is around secure FTP, but increasingly the industry is now moving towards web services where there is more automation and less interjection of human activity. And so obviously there is more standardization as we move towards web services and an increased level of automation across the industry. So those are the three areas that DDEX focuses on in order to achieve more efficient communication along the music industry value chain. Just a reminder, if you're not a member, DDEX has three categories of members: full members, who basically make up the largest number of our membership, and as benefits of membership, you get to attend as many or as few of the working group meetings that we have, the technical working groups, and obviously we have a number of different working groups focusing on different areas of the business. We have these plenary meetings, which are physical meetings, or at least they were until recently. And this is where we all gather together to assess where we are, report on what's been done, and start to set the work plan for future meetings or future periods of time. And then obviously we have an annual meeting, which is like most other companies. You can provide a working group chair. You get to comment on what we call committee draft, which are the last step before we actually publish a standard. And there's an internal DDEX period of time where these committee drafts are put out for review for a 30-day period. Fees for full membership are revenue-based as per the slide and obviously on our website. And then the other two categories of membership are charter members, who basically get the same benefits as full members, but are also able to nominate a board member. At the moment, there is a limit of 21 companies on the board. And then we have associate members. These don't participate in the actual work, but they have access to the site of all of the documentation and all the developments as we go through. And they, like everybody else, are able, or other members are able to comment on committee drafts. They are able, under certain circumstances, to attend plenary meetings, but we really do that as a mechanism to try and encourage people to move up to full members. So that's a quick summary of the membership situation. And the current list is on the website, ddex.net. As you may know, DDEX has about 8 families of standards, and our hopefully now famous tube map of the standards shows the types of companies who are involved in the exchange of the different messages. And the focus that we are obviously on today is the RDR standard, which is essentially between what are called music licensing companies, and that is to be distinguished from a mechanical licensing collective, which is obviously a consequence of the MMA in the US. Music licensing companies are those companies that look after producer and performer rights. And initially, at least, the RDR standards were really about communication amongst music licensing companies in different territories. But over the last 4 years or so, have also started to embrace communication between those music licensing companies and the recording industries or the record companies who are their members, if you like, or the people on behalf of whom they license. And also other projects. VRDB2 is another project in this sphere of activity within the value chain, and that is also going to be using the RDR standards or one of the standards to support the communication of data into this database project. Again, as many of you may well know, the thing that underpins the DDEX standards more than anything else is our data dictionary. It really defines the lingua franca of the music industry. And the data dictionary contains all the semantics of all the terms that appear in all of the standards and the structure of certain common composites. I've already mentioned sound recordings being one. And what the data dictionary does to a large extent is to act a little bit like a translator or a third language, in so much as if you're a sender of messages, you need to map your data structure to the DDEX messages, and then the receiver of the message does the same. Obviously, their data structure is going to be different, but it means that the two parties are able to actually talk to each other using the DDEX semantics and structures and actually understand each other, even if their own data models and database structures are entirely different. So the data dictionary is very much the beating heart of what we do. One further point before we actually dive into more of the detail, and I've sort of hinted at this already. Up until relatively recently, we called this group of standards the MLC standards, but as many of you know, that created quite a considerable amount of confusion between what we called MLCs, DDEX called MLCs, and the Mechanical Licensing Collective established under US law. So we have changed the name of the standard because we felt that even though we were there first, the US government probably wouldn't back down on this point. So that's why the change and the new nomenclature to try and avoid any confusion that might arise. And there was, on occasions, people turning up at MLC calls thinking we were talking about the Mechanical Licensing Collective. So clearly that was something that needed to be resolved. So hopefully that explanation will alleviate any confusion. However, we still use the term music licensing companies. And as I said, these are collective management organizations that represent producers of sound recordings and the performers that appear on the sound recordings. And like the collecting societies for musical works, they have an international network. And on the right there, you can see a number of those companies are members of DDEX in one capacity or another. And they obviously need to communicate amongst themselves in the same way as collecting societies for musical works, as well as with the producers and performers that they represent. So I'm going to hand over to Niels now, and he will talk a bit more about the detail of the RDR standards.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. So the RDR standards, well, there are actually three of them. In the past, the MLC standard, as we called it, as Mark has introduced, there was only one of those standards. It contained all of the specifications that we needed for the communication with and amongst music licensing companies. But with a change to radar, we basically took the opportunity to split the whole thing up and make it a little bit more logical, if you like, a little bit more modular. The first of those standards is RDR-N, or the radar notification, which is basically the standard that allows a record company to make a claim for rights in a sound recording or music video to a music licensing company. It also allows those kind of claims to be made on behalf of performers as well as producers, that is, record companies themselves. The RDR-N standard is also then used amongst those music licensing companies to distribute those claims across boundaries. As Mark has said, the music licensing companies have formed an international network, and if a record company, for example, in the UK makes a claim to the UK music licensing company, that company, PPL, would then be able to forward that claim to other countries' MLCs, music licensing companies, whether it's Sound Exchange or whether it's GVL in Germany and so forth, using the same standard. Once those claims have been made and have been distributed all over the world, you will need to get some information about the monies that have been generated, that have been collected, back to the rights holders. And that's where the radar revenue reporting, or RDR-R, comes into play. So that's for reporting revenue that has been generated by a music licensing company to either the sister music licensing company that has actually provided them with a claim, or to a record company under the same circumstances. And again, it allows producers as well as performer revenues to be reported. And last but not least, as Mark said, we're always quite keen on defining specific choreographies, who does what when. And while we have in the MLC standard, the existing MLC standard, a little bit of a choreography, now we're splitting that out because we now have two different message standards themselves, RDR-N and RDR-R, and therefore we need one separate standard that deals with how the stuff gets actually exchanged, file naming convention, manifests, and those kind of things. The RDR standards are still all based on FTP. As you see on this slide here, RDR-N is an XML-based standard. The reason why it is XML is because it basically uses the same structures that predominantly the ERN standard, the release notification standard, uses. That's the standard that a record company uses to provide online retailers with product information, with sound recording information, with musical work information. And because a record company already has that information in a DDEX format, wouldn't it make sense to use basically the same format to send the same information or similar information to music licensing companies? Clearly it does, thus we're using XML as the language there, or the structure there. The reporting side is a flat file format. That is basically tabular data. It just tells you, here is a sound recording, identified title, much more is not necessary, and then how much money has been generated for what type of usage, and what's the currency that's being used, and that's more or less it. It's a little bit more complex than that, but that's basically what the reporting side is. And in that case, a flat file structure is much better suited than an XML structure. Though to be fair, the current standard, that's the MLC 1.3, rather 1.4, that does also contain some messaging for reporting sales and usages using XML. But we're starting to, the industry is starting to move towards the flat filed version. Once that is being published, we're putting the final touches on that specification on it at the moment. We've got a couple of conference calls in the next couple of weeks, and hopefully that should then be published over the summer. When it comes to the RDR-N, we have version 1.4 of the existing MLC standard and version 1.5, which is a slight update with a number of small updates, should be published around at the same time as the first version of the RDR-R standard. And hopefully also at the same time we'll be publishing the version 1 of the choreography standard. So what are the choreographies? They are actually, to be fair, fairly simple. When you're looking at RDR-N, the notification, well, looking at producer claims, there are 4 messages that are interesting. But it's all about music licensing companies or record company providing such claims to music licensing companies. And the main message is the Declaration of Sound Recording Rights Claim message. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it does explain pretty much what it contains. In some cases, a record company or music licensing company may have made such a claim in error. In that case, they may need to revoke such a claim, and there is a message for it. It's important to note that when you lose a right, you would not use the revoke message. That would be done during a declaration of sound recording rights claims, because if you're losing a right, you still have the right to collect monies for the period in which you were the rights holder. Therefore, you still need to make a claim for that period. So this revocation message is only for revoking erroneous claims that were made once. In some cases, it happens that a music licensing company receives monies for a specific sound recording for which they don't have any claim, so they can then request such a claim. That's what the request sound recording rights claim message does. The answer for that would then be, hopefully, a declaration of sound recording rights claim message, so that at that stage, the music licensing company that has received the monies is now in possession of also the claims, and therefore it can then map those things together and ensure that the right monies go to the right people. And last but not least, there is a status update message. The question that music licensing companies need to answer, especially record companies is if they have received a claim, how do they internally represent it? Was that actually successfully registered? There's quite a lot of information, as we will see in a moment, in that message. Was that information now A, enough, and B, correct enough so that the music licensing company can now operate on that claim? Or were there potential errors, potential conflicts, ownership conflicts, to people providing a claim for the same sound recording for the same territory, which may lead to overclaims? How can that be handled? Well, only through this claim status update message can the record companies be informed of those overclaims, and they can then take action and correct those overclaims so that the music licensing companies again has a claim for 100% for a specific territory and can operate. There's a very similar set of messages for the performer mandates. There's an assertion for a mandate to declare mandates. There's a revocation for, again, erroneous claims that have been made, not for declaring that one has lost a mandate, but simply to say there was some error. And there's this assertion of collection mandate status update message is again the same as the previous status update message. What has actually been ingested into the music licensing company's system to make sure that the sender of the original claim or mandate will actually know what has arrived. And then when we're coming to the RDR-R message, the royalty reporting, well, that's fairly simple, that you have a music licensing company that sends that message, that revenue declaration message, either to a music licensing company in a different territory or to a record company it's basically an answer to a rights notification message, RDR-N message, so that here you asked me to represent this work, this sound recording, sorry. Here is the revenue that I've generated for you for this. As I said, for compatibility reasons, the RDR-N message also has two reporting messages that we developed in the past. I would expect over time those messages to fall out of use and eventually be removed from the standard, but certainly not at this stage. So how does the RDR-R standard look like? It's what I would call a rich tabular separated value file. So it's a table Excel kind of format based on UTF-8, so all the different character sets can comfortably be handled. It separates different records by carriage returns, different cells by tabular, but it also has the concept of a secondary delimiter by which you can, for example, provide multiple, say, identifiers for one party within a single cell. If you have, I don't know, John Lennon, and he has two different identifiers, you can provide them in one cell. And we're not limited to a specific number of predefined cells for that. You can have a maximum of, I don't know, 3 artist names or three identifiers. This gives us the flexibility to have as many as it's necessary. The standard then defines different record types. There are headers and footers that basically tell you who sends the message to whom and how many records are there to make sure that the recipient actually has received everything that they need to receive as a checksum, basically. Then there are a number of summary lines, either on the whole statement as well as then on specific allocated parties. So if you're having a radar report that talks about 3 different record companies, then you would have for each of those record companies an allocated party summary, and you may also have them for different artists if it's with respect to recording artists. And then you have individual details, either for sound recordings or for music videos or for other details that might then include blank tape, levies, and those kind of issues, or revenues that have been generated from lawsuits that have materialized. All of those kind of different things that need to be accounted for can be dealt with using the RDR-3 record. So the RDR summary records 1, 2 are the summary for the statement and the allocated party, and then the radar detail records 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3 are then for sound recording, music videos, and other details. This is a fairly rich way of formatting the data for a flat file. It's actually already in use within the DDEX community as part of the sales reporting, digital sales reporting standard, which uses exactly the same structure, and it works quite well there and has been used by more than 100 companies as far as we know. One of the things that's quite important when you implement the standard is these internal record IDs that exist, so that you can then say that a specific sound recording is linked to a specific party, for example. So there is a pointer within the message from this RDR-1 record to an RSO2 record. Those kind of things need to be taken into account. But it works quite well. Compared to the RDR-N, though, the RDR-R standard is really simple. So the rights claim message, very simple. Like all DDEX message, you have a message header that tells you who sends the message to whom, when was it created, and so forth. And it mirrors the header record that we had in the flat file. You then have an optional message notification period that tells you for which period a rights claim is being made, and then you have a list of resources that can be sound recording or music videos. And as I said, that's quite a long list of fields. We can have a look, or I suggest we'll have a look at some of those details in a moment. One thing that's quite interesting in this context is this right statement profile attribute on the left-hand side. One of the things that we have learned fairly recently when discussing this standard is that there are actually two different ways in which such a claim can be made. A record company could say to a music licensing company, here is what I own. Now, please look at the agreement between the label and the music licensing company, the so-called mandate. What of the ownership that I have just declared to you, you can represent. I've asked you to represent these type of rights in these territories. So can you please take the subset of those two, what I own and what you have been given as a mandate, and represent that? Alternatively, the record company could explicitly say, this is what I want you to represent. And these are the two statement profiles, as we call them. We need to spell that out and saying, hey, this is the message, what I'm telling you is an explicit mandate, or it's just what I own, and now please use our general agreement to find out what really you meant to represent. This is something that the existing specification cannot express because we've only found that out recently. But from version 1.4 onwards, this is actually part of the standard. The other message is this assertion of a collection mandate, which is much simpler, which is regarding the mandate for a performer. You have the same message header and then just the collection mandate, what has been asked. And that mandate basically says who provides that and what are the details for the mandate. And we can have a look at that in a moment. One of the things that is quite important, though, is I've just shown you this huge, long lists of fields that the rights claim message contains. Not all of those tags are mandatory. So a record company does not have to make all of those fields available or provide data on all of those fields just because they are in the standard. To make that clear, DDEX has basically developed two profiles. One we call the core data profile, and one is the recommended profile. Obviously, we would recommend that people always use the recommended profile, which is, and I've copied this from the specification, generally sufficient for many music licensing companies to allocate revenue when the recording is used and to pay out within the distribution. There is a little bit of weasel words in here. It's generally sufficient for many music licensing companies. The reason for this is what different companies require to register claims and pay out is up to them. They can change those rules whenever those companies want to do that, or whenever they are obliged by their local lawmaker to deal with a new legal situation. Thus, DDEX simply cannot make a claim that this will work everywhere. We don't know whether it will work in Outer Mongolia. We just we don't have the ability to find out that it works for all territories. And therefore, we can only recommend this and say, if you're doing this, you should be all right. Given the membership of the working group, and Mark has shown you the list of members, I would think that it's a really good chance that you cover everything, but legally we can't go any further. In many cases, though, record companies don't have all of that data, admittedly. And so there is a core data profile, which is sufficient data for many music licensing companies to register a recording. So at least you put a stake down and saying, hey, I own this. And then over time, the music licensing companies may obtain further data, either from yourself or from other sources that will then basically fill up the data so that it will come to the recommended profile, and then they can also pay out. But that's all the data that's there. So let's have a look at those message, and let's start with the Declaration of Sound Recording Rights Claim message. There it is. So this is the resource list, and let's have a look at the sound recording. And it's as I said, quite a big thing. Everything here that has a thin line is optional. Only things that have a bold line is actually mandatory in the standard. And these two profiles, this core data profile and the recommended profile, would need to be looked at in addition to looking just at the XML schema that we're looking at here. It's also important to notice that the structure that we're looking at here has been inherited from the release notification standard. So a lot of those fields that are in here may actually not be that useful for a music licensing company. But for the purpose of developing a coherent and common way of describing sound recordings in this case, we still have some of those fields in here. One of those is the sound recording type. Everywhere it's important to note in the DDEX world whether a sound recording is based on a musical work or not, except for the communication with and amongst music licensing companies, which is why here it's an optional field. Can labels provide it? Yes, if they want to, but it's actually not that important. The same is whether something is artist related, but it differentiates whether something is an interview that an artist has been given as a sound recording. Quite important for a DSP to know when they want to make the things available, not so much for a music licensing company. Sound recording ID, that is clearly critical, and you can provide an ISRC, catalog numbers, proprietary IDs for a sound recording. We have an associate sound recording ID, which is something that is used in the VRDB2 project to provide additional sound recordings and sometimes old sound recording identifiers that have come out of use for a sound recording, but it's still helpful to communicate those in order to allow matching to happen easier. Information about a musical work, you really don't need it. The resource reference, well, this is technically mandatory, but again, it's something that is of no value data-wise. So you just need to number them. The first you put into this message, you just call A1. The second you call A2. The third you call A3, and you just number them through, and you're done with it. You have title. You have something to differentiate whether something is a live version or a studio version. You can provide instrumentation information and lots of information here that is helpful, especially for DSPs. But as you can see, they're all optional fields. Duration, that again is important for music licensing companies, hence it's a mandatory field. And without having that, you can't even provide any claim. Lots of dates. And the core of the information when it comes to describing the sound recording is actually in the sound recording details by territory composite. Something that is not very elegant, and we have gone away from using that in other standards. All of our standards used to have that, but we've now started to roll all of those fields into the sound recording fields, and that will happen with MLC at some stage as well, but not for certainly a couple of years, I would think. So you would then provide sound recording details by territory. You would give one territory code worldwide. That's the general agreement amongst music licensing companies. And there you then provide the title, a display artist name, display artists. That's quite important for the differentiation between those two, helps you to deal with collaborations. So when you have a display artist would be, if you have two artists collaborating, you would have two display artists, the two people collaborating, and then the display artist name is how the whole thing would be displayed on the product as a collaboration. You have information about conductors, about performers, the label name, when was something released, P line, rights controller, quite important. We'll go into that in details. And you can see those fields, they all make sense, I would think. Let's have a quick look at two other items. The performer. What information do we need to know about a performer? If I can open it, that would help. Again, looks like a lot, but it also makes a lot of sense when you look at it. You have information about a party identifier or party name. So, I don't know, John Lennon. You can provide an ISNI for John Lennon. You can say, that has something to do with, delegation, but that is now being dealt with by the other message to deal with artist rights. So this will also fall out of use, I would suspect. You have he's a male, he's a Brit, he was born in Liverpool in 1940s, he died in New York in 1980. That helps you to identify the artists. Governing agreement type has more to do with musical works than with the music licensing side of things. You can provide contact information, but again, that is rarely used. He was living in the U.S., citizenship, well, he was British, of course. What is his main genre? What did he contribute to a specific sound recording? Well, he played a specific role. I don't know, he was a musician. It's a primary role, but he might have multiple, or he may have multiple contributions. One of them would be his primary contribution. Is this contribution featured? Is this contracted? Where and when did it happen? What was his instrument that he played? What was the primary instrument? So there you can actually say what specifically and where specifically did that specific artist contribute something to the sound recording. And the other bit that is worth looking at is the rights controller. So which record company is asserting a right for a specific territory? So which is the record company that asserts the right? What's the right share that they own about it? What are the delegated usage rights? So for what is it? What are the which territory, for which period? Is it for downloads? Is it for use types? And those kind of things. So that's, I think, a quick whistle-stop tour, and it really is a whistle-stop tour around the message. So the question that Danny has asked is whether the different standards have different ways to describe recording information at this stage. And the answer is yes, they are different, but we try to minimize those differences. When we started, we tried to have one way of describing sound recordings, for example, or one way to describe musical works. But if we're just looking at a sound recording, when communicating that between record companies and DSPs, there is significantly more information that needs to flow than between a record company and a music licensing company. All the stuff that I would call marketing information, MLCs don't really care about it. DSPs, they do care about it. Therefore, we had to develop a way of deviating, for the different standards to deviate from one another in that respect. We have always a core set of fields, And looking at sound recording here, and as I said, this is an older structure, you always have a type and an identifier and this reference and reference title. In later versions, but that's a function of time, it's just called title. Those fields you have everywhere, but some standards then don't have any of the other fields or other fields. And you're right, Danny. The question, or his follow-up is: are the difference more around what data is required? Yes, that's what is required for a specific business transaction. That's the difference, and that's why also the structures differ slightly. The changes look more than they actually are because the core is always the same, both with respect to sound recordings, or videos, or musical works, or parties. But yes, all the information around it simply is different. So that, as I said, that was the whistle-stop tour over the main message that the RDR standard offers. I'll hand back over to Mark to talk about RDX. But if there are more questions, please do fire them at us, and we'll try to answer them today or later even, if you're thinking of something after the call. Mark.
Thanks, Niels. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, an area where the RDR-N standard is being used extensively as it rolls out is with regard to a project called RDX. This is a project that's been jointly put together by the World Independent Network, WIN, and IFPI. And the service itself is operated by PPL in the UK. And the purpose of this is to basically increase the MLC's access to authoritative registrations of repertoire. Because one of the problems that comes with the sort of network of collective management organizations is that the same data, or rather the data about the same entities, is being registered in every different country, but of course it may not actually be exactly the same data. And so the ability to slightly centralize the way data is registered, cuts down on the cost of registration, particularly for multinational companies, but also for local labels as well, but also increases the chance that all of the music licensing companies operating in the network are working off basically the same data, which at the moment is not always the case. And so that is what the RDX project is about. And essentially, data sources, basically record companies, can submit repertoire data to RDX using the RDR-N. And RDX's job is then to detect and resolve any conflicts. On the other side, the recipients of the data, so the MLCs, can subscribe to receive that repertoire data and also send back the way in which that repertoire data, send back to RDX how that repertoire data is represented in the individual MLC systems. And then that information goes back to the original supplier or the original source of the data. So it's a kind of virtual circle of double checks that allow the quality of data to improve over time as more and more sources provide data into RDX, and more MLCs receive and process that data. So that's essentially what the RDX is about. And as you can see from that slide, the different messages that Niels has explained to you about that appear in the RDR standards get used for different steps along the way. And clearly, as a consequence, RDX is very much built around the DDEX messages and how those can get used. The same is true, as we have also mentioned, with regard to the VRDB project, which is much more about the performers. It's essentially similar to RDX. It's actually operated by a different entity called SCARPRA, but the same basic principles apply, and DDEX messages are used to supply data into that performer database. And so that's a kind of real-world example. There are two real-world examples of how DDEX is being deployed, not just to enable bilateral communication, but to actually support industry-wide projects that are intended to produce much more efficiency and reduce expenditure in administering all this data and ensuring that the right people get paid. And so I think that's a useful example of sort of DDEX in action in a broader way than simply communicating between two parties.
Which, of course, is happening.
Which, of course, is happening anyway, but
exactly.
It's an added extra, as it were. So I think that brings us to the end of the presentation on the RDR standards. I don't know if there are any more questions that people may have. So the question is, which MLCs are involved in RDX? So I'll come to the second one in a minute. Basically, all of them in principle, but it's happening on a gradual basis. Initially, there's a small number of labels are being integrated into RDX and a small number of music licensing companies, and over time that will grow out. And again, at the moment, it is a little bit focused on Europe and North America, but again, that will also grow out to other regions like APAC and Latin America. In response to the other question about what was the last organization, SCARPRA is an umbrella organization for all of the collective management organizations that deal with performers rights. And that's whether they deal with performers' rights only, which happens in France, for example, where you have SCPP, which is a CMO just for the producers, for the record companies. And then there are a couple of CMOs that deal with performer rights. I suppose the majority of territories have combined. So PPL does performers and sound producers, record companies. And so PPL, on behalf of the performers it represents, is a member of SCARPRA. Are there any other questions anyone has? Okay. Well, as I said, I hope you've found the presentation helpful. We will be putting a recording of the presentation and the audio on our website over the next day or two, so you can actually get the information back again and re-listen and review the slide deck. I will send you a link to where that will eventually end up. It'll take a couple of days to get there. When I contact you about hopefully filling out the questionnaire, that I mentioned earlier on in right at the beginning of the webinar. So that's all we have for you, and as I say, I hope you found that helpful, and maybe see or hear you at future webinars in the series. So have a good rest of the day, depending on how much of the rest of the day you've got. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.